Dark Elves are one of the more overlooked races from Rhea Cluster. They're an aggressive darkness type deck that focuses on using your life as a resource for effect damage and graveyard recursion. Their presence early on was very middling. They lacked support from the previous cluster that Feyre received from cards like Sacred Elf and Melfi, and they couldn't keep up in pace with Prisia or even Darkbook as an aggro deck. They gained more of an identity as the cluster went on, turning into a deck that primarily uses the graveyard as a gimmick for setup to gain field advantage and hand advantage. Unfortunately, a certain ruler came along that had an instant speed, unchaseable answer to their gimmick, which gated them even harder than before Scheherazad's release. This, combined with the fragility the deck had due to using life as an extra resource, made them unfavorable for most of Lapis Rhea format. But I like them, so we're going to talk about them. Dark Elves have a dedicated ruler in Freyla. She's a darkness ruler with a judgment cost of 2 Dark Will and 1 Void, and at the end of each of your turns she can deal 300 damage to you in order to add 1 Dark Elf from the graveyard to your hand. The potency of this ability is criminally underrated. Graveyard setup was, and still is, a rather rare mechanic, and the best of Freyla's fellow Dark Elves either have effects that will eventually put things in the grave or benefit off having things there. The true power of this ability as a combo piece will become more evident as we get further into the archetype. Freyla's J-Ruler side, Freyla the Revolutionist, has a 10-8 body and comes with a variety of effects. When she enters the field, she can pull a Dark Elf from the grave and put it into the field with her. This effect was primarily meant to work with Hilda and Safina early on, who can gimmick each other onto the field for a +3 in board presence, but there proved to be better options as more Dark Elves were released. Freyla also grants a 4/4 boost and swiftness to another Dark Elf whenever she attacks, and you can pay 1 Fire Will to grant her swiftness herself. She can also pay a Fire and a Darkness to deal 100 damage multiplied by the number of Dark Elves you control to your opponent, an effect that reflects one of the archetype's early gimmicks of dealing minor amounts of damage over time. Freyla is meant to be a game ender. Her judgment cost combined with her swiftness gain requires you to have a total of 4 will open. Your main combo with her should be something like flip, grab Hilda, Hilda grabs Safina, Freyla gains swiftness, swing for 1,000 and give the 4/4 in swiftness to one of the 2 elves, and then swing for another 11 assuming you're at the threshold for Hilda and Safina to boost themselves. Whichever elf is left standing can block for Freyla on your opponent's turn if the game has yet to end, and then you can rinse and repeat for the next turn or use Freyla's active to close out the game. All in all, she's a solid ruler that can do plenty of interesting combos as well as toolbox her own archetype from the grave. The problem is that she wouldn't see much decent support until almost the end of the cluster, when her form of aggro would become an irrelevant playstyle. There are 2 1-cost Dark Elves in Ancient Knights, and the first is Dark Elf Spy. He's a 4/4 Darkness Resonator that deals 100 damage to both players at the end of its controller's turn. This effect plays into the Dark Elf gimmick of slowly burning both players to death that made up much of the archetype's early support. Plenty of the bigger resonators from the archetype reap benefits off either taking damage or hitting a life threshold, and cards like Spy were meant to help you get there. He unfortunately doesn't do much else, and his effect can be more of a detriment than an advantage. There are plenty of other ways to lose life than bank on having a non-threatening 1-cost remain on the field long enough for his effect to pay off more than once. The other 1-cost introduced in Ancient Knights is arguably one of the archetype's better cards, Shade Assassin. He's a 2/2 Darkness Resonator that gains swiftness if you control another Dark Elf, and destroys a Resonator that he does damage to. Freyla being a Dark Elf means that he will always have swiftness when you play with her as your ruler, and his destruction effect makes him good on both offense and defense. His low stats mean that he will probably die at anything he fights, but he can be recurred back to hand with Freyla's ability and give you a setup for the next turn. While he's outdone stat-wise by other swiftness resonators, his utility is undeniable. He's a solid 2 or 3 in any aggressive build. There are 3 2-cost Dark Elves in Ancient Knights. The first is Treasonous Guard, a 6/6 Darkness Resonator that deals 200 damage to each player when he enters the field. There's really not much to say about this guy. He's a slightly worse version of Spy with slightly better stats. He adds little to no utility to the deck outside of killing you faster, something that's already been established as easy to do without having to rely on goofy damage effects. Hilda, Freyla's left hand, and Safina, Freyla's right hand, are easier to talk about together than they are apart. They share similar stat lines, with one being 4/5 and the other a 5/4. They both boost themselves to 7/7 when you're under 2,000 life. The real gimmick comes from their enter effects. Hilda can pull Safina from the grave to the field if you do not already control a Safina, and Safina can pull Hilda from your deck to your hand if you do not already control a Hilda. You play Safina early on to search out Hilda, and then later play Hilda to grab Safina back. As I already mentioned, these effects work great with Freyla's enter ability, since it can potentially set your field up to be a +3. At their release, they were arguably some of the best 2-cost options you had in the deck, but now you can get by with running one copy of each unless you expect to have your graveyard continually destroyed and removed. Both of the boss monster resonators introduced in Ancient Knights benefit off the self-damage effects of the archetype. The first is the 3-cost Dark Elf Sorcerer. She's a 7/7 body that deals damage to your opponent equal to the amount of any effect damage dealt to you by a ruler or resonator. This ability doubles the damage your opponent receives from Spy and Guard, as well as forces your opponent to take 300 damage whenever you grab an elf back with Freyla. The problem is that by the time you would be playing her, you would no longer have a use to drop either of these lower cost cards, nor would you be actively digging through your grave unless you've somehow convinced your opponent to continually block or swing into your Shade Assassin. Sorcerer represents a problem that Dark Elves as a whole have, especially early on. They're really slow. The 4-cost boss, Dark Elf of the Murky Grove, has the same issues as Sorcerer. Her effect is reliant on you taking damage, but instead of dealing it back to your opponent, she gains a 1/1 counter. Her effect doesn't limit the source of damage to just resonators and rulers. The problem is that she only gains a single counter for it, meaning you have to find multiple sources of low damage pings to make her a threat and stay alive. Her 4-cost body means she won't be hitting the field until mid or late game, when your life is already probably going to be low from other effects you've used on top of the probability of just taking damage naturally through combat. Her effect really should have just given her counters equal to the damage taken, then she could at least be an 11/11 with Freyla on the turn she's played, putting her slightly above the curve compared to similar cost resonators. Moving along, Advent of the Demon King introduced the only set of Dark Elves outside the archetype's typical darkness typing. Lore-wise, the Dark Elves had fallen under the influence of the Demon King Welser, who happened to be the fire ruler for the set. Hilariously, they provide almost no synergy with him, but do give some nice support to their own archetype. The only 1-cost introduced in this set is Majin Dark Elf, a 6/6 resonator with swiftness that can only be played if you've taken damage that turn. She was pretty underwhelming on release due to there not being a reliable way to damage yourself without playing another card before her, but after the release of Null Magic Stone on the next set, she became a 4-of staple. I really don't have much else to say about this one other than that she can brick easily on you if you don't get your Null Stone early, but since New Valhalla there have been plenty of other ways to make sure you get that damage in. Freyla's Devotee is the first 2-cost Fire Dark Elf, and she's a 5/5 body with an effect that gives her a 2/2 boost anytime you take damage until the end of the turn. She comes in with a lot of the same hindrances as Majin and Murky Grove. First, there's no easy way to damage yourself reliably when she can attack or block, and second, the boost is negligible compared to the utility other 2-cost resonators can give you. Freyla, Servant of Demon Fire, is the next 2-cost, and she is much more helpful than her fan club. She has a 6/6 body and can gain swiftness the turn she's played if you control no other resonators. She can also grant another resonator 400 attack and swiftness whenever she swings, but requires you to banish that resonator at the end of your turn. Resonator Freyla works well in plenty of Dark Elf combos. You can play her on an empty board and then follow it with another 1-cost Dark Elf to do anywhere from 1200 to 1600 damage, and then recur whatever card you had to banish with Ruler Freyla's effect. Late game you can flip over Ruler Freyla, grab the Resonator Freyla, and then play an elf from hand to potentially deal lethal that turn. This card works wonders with Majin Subjugation, which allows you to sack a resonator you control to dig for a Wicked Spirit with a cost less than or equal to the sacrifice monster +2. So typically you would want to play Gravekeeper turn 1, send something, then turn 2 play Subjugation, slap down Freyla, and either play Shade Assassin or Majin Dark Elf depending on what you sent, and now you have 2 Swiftness resonators. Devoted Squadron is the last of the Fire Dark Elves, and it's a 7/7 cost that searches a copy of itself from the deck when it enters the field if you have less than 2000 life. However, it disables the search effect on that copy. While a +2 in field advantage sounds cool in theory, the stats on these cards don't line up well with its effect. You would ideally only want to run 2 of them so one copy can search the other, but you're better off just running Hilda and Safina as they have the same stat lines as Devoted Squadron at that 2k threshold, and have more variety in their searching ability. The only style of deck you'd really want to consider them for is a subjugation build, since they can be easy ways to get out Beelzebub on the field, who happens to be a 5-cost Wicked Spirit. There are 2 Darkness Dark Elves in Advent, and both of them are 4-cost. The less useful of the 2 is Dark Elf Fugitive, an 8/8 resonator that searches out either an elf or a dark elf from your deck when it enters the field and puts it into your hand. While searching is always cool, it shouldn't be attached to something with this high a cost on this small a body. The fact he can search regular elves is interesting, but there's really no archetypal synergy between the 2, making the effect more of a lore-related thing than something that's actually worth running. He'd be more worth it if he could put the search card into the field instead of your hand. Not like Dark Elves actually have something that'll be too deadly to play from deck. The last 4-cost is Hilda and Safina, a 10/10 zombie Dark Elf that causes its owner to lose 1,000 life when they enter the field, and then gain 1,000 life when they leave. They also gain Swiftness, Flying, and First Strike if you have less than 1,000 life. This is the boss monster synergy Dark Elves need. They have a good stat line for their cost, they play into the life threshold gimmick for the archetype, and they can easily trigger their own effect to gain simple skills with their enter ability. The downside here is that you really don't want to be playing them too late into the game if you can't end it that turn, as you likely won't live to see your next turn. They make a decent one of, since it's more beneficial to grab them from the grave with Freyla than it is to draw into them and hardcast them from your hand. Time-Spinning Witch was the set to finally introduce the last bit of support needed to round out Dark Elf's best gimmick and turn them into a potentially strong toolbox. Dark Elf Gravekeeper is a 1-cost 4/3 that sends 1 Dark Elf from your deck to the graveyard when it enters the field. The amount of options this card opens up cleans plenty of space in your Dark Elf core. Before, you would need to run multiple copies of certain cards to guarantee you had them, even if their inherent value is low. But with Gravekeeper you can get by with only needing 1 or 2 copies of any particular boss or endgame combo. She also opens up consistent turn 2 plays by letting you pitch Freyla, Safina, or even Majin to grab back with Ruler Freyla at the end of your first turn. She is an easy 4 of staple that can set up both early and late game plays for Freyla. Lily the Last Flower is the only 2-cost Dark Elf from the set, and she comes with a variety of abilities. She has a 5/5 body and deals -2/-2 to a resonator for each Dark Elf in your graveyard. She can also gain a 1/1 counter and drain by removing a Dark Elf in your graveyard from play. Despite her low cost, Lily is meant to be a late game card that can potentially remove a big threat through her negative effect, and then pump herself up through grave removal. She can flip a game around since instances of drain stack. If you remove 1 Dark Elf, you gain 600 life. If you remove 2, you gain 14. If you remove 3, you gain 24, and so on and so forth. She's a decent one-of thanks to Gravekeeper, but I personally feel like there are better potential boss monsters. You don't really want to be gaining life while playing Dark Elves since many of the beneficial effects come from you having low life in the first place. Lily's Protector is meant to combo with the Dark Elf Princess. She's a 7/7 3-cost that grants a Dark Elf barrier until the end of the turn she's removed from the grave. You can target Freyla with this effect too, since it doesn't state it has to be a resonator. Other than that, she's pretty underwhelming. It would be nice if she had a way to remove herself, giving you a way to keep your elves alive that doesn't rely on you also having Lily out. There's only 1 Dark Elf in the final set of Rhea Cluster, and it's the Resistor of Destiny. She's a 7/7 3-cost that deals -3/-3 to a resonator your opponent controls when it leaves the field for the graveyard. I honestly can't think of a more underwhelming way to close out the resonator line for this archetype. Resistor has almost zero synergy with any part of the archetype, and falls back onto the same low stats for high cost problem that the earlier Dark Elf boss monsters had. If her effect triggered when she entered the graveyard from anywhere, it could at least be used in combination with Gravekeeper to remove your opponent's turn 1 play. But instead we're given some really cool art on an arguably underwhelming card. The Dark Elf chant lining is also rather depressing. There are only 2 direct support cards, and they both came out in the first set of the cluster. The first is Lethal Arrow, a 1-cost darkness chant that destroys a damaged resonator. Dark Elves lack a way to ping resonators for damage, which pretty much invalidates this card. If resonators like Lily or Resistor did damage instead of minuses, it could arguably be used for some pretty interesting combos. The other chant that directly references Dark Elves is Tactics of the Dark Elves, a 3-cost card that gives 2 resonators Eternal and Bane effects, making it so they can't be destroyed and destroy anything they do damage to until the end of the turn. Once again, Dark Elves lack the proper synergy to make use of this card since it's best used with resonators that either have damage effects or precision, two things that none of the resonators in the archetype have. That's not to say Dark Elves are completely out of luck when it comes to chance support. Plenty of generic darkness and fire cards can give them an edge and help them control the field while they set up their combo pieces and plays. Burn spells in particular help put pressure on your opponent early, especially if you happen to get Nullstone and Majin Dark Elf out on turn 1. Every ruler in Rhea received their own special stone, and Freyla's is Demonic Soulstone. It produces darkness and has the added effect of resting it and paying 2 will to deal 100 damage to both you and your opponent for each Dark Elf you control. It's okay, I guess. It's certainly a lot better than plenty of other special stones given to other rulers. It's a decent will sink for the deck later in the game, but at the time it came out there were way better ways to spend your leftover will than just burning yourself and your opponent for maybe 200 or 300 damage. Dark Elves have lots of options thanks to their pseudo toolbox combo with Gravekeeper and Freyla. You only have to run your 1-drops in high numbers since it's very easy to recur and search out your mid and late game plays. I'll include a few lists with different focuses and mid games to help you get started. The first deck uses what I would call the standard Dark Elf core plus other resonators like Belial as splash options. The Fallen Angel boss works great in Dark Elves as he also has a life-related gimmick and can punish wide boards with his Enter effect. The downside is that he also wipes shore board, but if properly timed with him and Hilda and Safina out, you can gain life and wipe away any threats your opponent has as well. Dark Riding Hood is a similarly good splash card since she gains benefits from having lower life and can also give the deck a decent removal option. The second deck is built around Jeanne d'Arc and Faith in the Darkness. Most of the important Dark Elves are 2-cost or less, and both Darkness and Fire have a large amount of useful 2-cost or less resonators. The deck is a little bit slower than the normal Dark Elf build, but it creates a solid field that comes with plenty of ways to protect itself. Jeanne can give herself Eternal, Ray and Zero give your resonators Pseudo Barrier, and the 2-cost Dark Hood is able to give herself Barrier to Red and Black. This particular list has plenty of room for improvement, as I have to admit I haven't tested it nearly as much as the standard build. There are some other splash options to consider with Freyla. You could always run something like Osiris to cause potential disruption to your opponent, but his effect is more beneficial to a ruler like Scarlet who wants to quickly empty their hand to put pressure on. He does effectively become a discard 1 for his revival ability though, since you can just pitch a Dark Elf and get it back with Freyla. I already talked a bit about Majin Subjugation, but you can combo this card with Decayed Knight to easily dig out stronger Wicked Spirits like Beelzebub. Decayed Knight also gives you the benefit of having another way to remove Lily's Protector, even if you can only do it on your turn. Overall, Dark Elves are the middle ground for Fire Darkness decks. They offer several aggressive and control options, but are outdone on both sides of the spectrum by rulers better tooled for those playstyles. Where they shine is in their consistency and early game pressure, which unfortunately doesn't carry well into the mid and late game without support from other archetypes. They also are easily disrupted, and sometimes canceling a Gravekeeper search or a Freyla graveyard grab is enough to throw the deck off for the rest of the match. I personally really enjoy Darkness decks that step away from hard control like Dark Elves or Vampires, and I hope that enough generic support comes out for them over the next cluster that they can finally see some play at competitive events.